Welcome to Godless and Grounded. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and nowhere does it apply more than to the Christian claim that a man, 2,000 years ago, physically rose from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus is the foundation stone of Christianity. Without it, the entire religion collapses. Even the Apostle Paul admitted this in his letter to the Corinthians, saying, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." That is not an outsider saying it. That is one of Christianity's own voices, admitting the resurrection is the single event everything hinges on. So let's look at this claim. A man brutally executed by the Roman Empire, left for dead, placed in a tomb, somehow returns to life after 3 days, appears to a select group of followers, and then ascends into heaven. If that happened, it would be the most important historical event in human history. But if it didn't happen, then the story is just that, a story. And when we strip away tradition, emotion, and dogma, what we find is that the resurrection is not history. It's a tale written decades after the supposed events, with contradictions, missing evidence, and problems that don't stand up to scrutiny. First, let's consider the historical silence. You'd expect an event as massive as someone rising from the dead to be recorded not just by his close followers, but also by historians, Roman officials, or even ordinary people. After all, Jerusalem was a buzzing city under Roman occupation. The Romans documented executions, rebellions, and unusual events. Yet not a single Roman historian mentions the resurrection. Not Tacitus, not Josephus in his authentic writings, not Suetonius, not Pliny the Younger. None of them record anything about Jesus rising from the dead. In fact, for the first 100 years after Jesus' supposed resurrection, the silence is deafening. The only accounts we have are within Christian texts themselves, written not as objective history but as faith documents, often decades later and full of contradictions. Imagine today, if someone claimed a man rose from the dead in your city. Wouldn't there be at least one newspaper article, one eyewitness reported, one independent confirmation? And yet, from the first century, nothing. Next, the contradictions. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the primary sources Christians use for the resurrection story. But line them up side by side, and the problems scream out. Who went to the tomb? Mark says it was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Matthew says just Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Luke says a whole group of women went. John, oddly enough, has Mary Magdalene going alone. What did they see there? Mark says a young man in white. Matthew says an angel who rolled back the stone. Luke says 2 men in dazzling clothes. John says 2 angels sitting inside. Those are not minor details, those are glaring differences. And who saw Jesus first? Matthew says the women. Luke says 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. John says Mary Magdalene alone. Paul, in his letters, doesn't even mention the women at all. He says Jesus first appeared to Peter. If this were a courtroom, and 4 witnesses told stories this inconsistent, the case would be thrown out instantly. If the Gospels can't even agree on who saw what, how can we treat this as reliable history? Another major problem is the empty tomb narrative. Christians claim the tomb was found empty as proof of resurrection. But an empty tomb doesn't prove anything. It proves only that the body wasn't there. Bodies can be stolen, moved, or misplaced. In fact, in Matthew's own gospel, the Jewish leaders are said to accuse the disciples of stealing the body. That tells us this was already a rumor circulating at the time. If even the earliest opponents of Christianity accused the disciples of theft, that alone shows the empty tomb story wasn't universally convincing. And then there's the timing of when the resurrection belief even appears. The earliest Christian writings we have are Paul's letters, written around 20 to 25 years after Jesus' death. Paul never met Jesus in person. He doesn't describe an empty tomb, women at the grave, or any of the dramatic gospel details. Instead, Paul talks about Jesus appearing to him in visions, the same way he supposedly appeared to others. For Paul, the resurrection wasn't a physical event but a spiritual revelation. That's crucial. The earliest Christian belief in resurrection was visionary, not historical. The idea of dying and rising gods was also not unique. In the ancient world, myths about deities who die and return were everywhere. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Mithras in Persia, all had stories of death and rebirth tied to them. The concept was already in the cultural bloodstream. Early Christians simply applied it to their teacher, Jesus. Think about it like this. Every religion tells miracle stories about its founders. Hindus tell miracles of Krishna lifting mountains. Buddhists tell of Buddha walking immediately after birth. Muslims tell of Muhammad splitting the moon. Do we believe these events literally happened? No. We understand they are religious myths. So why treat the resurrection differently? Let's bring it closer to home with a modern example. Imagine if someone in 2025 claimed their leader had died and risen again. The claim would be met with skepticism, demands for evidence, medical records, photos, videos, testimony from independent sources. Without that, no one would take it seriously. And yet, Christians are asked to believe in a resurrection that supposedly happened 2,000 years ago with zero contemporary evidence, and with stories that contradict each other. And here's another point. The resurrection appearances always happen in private to believers. There are no public showings to the masses, no neutral witnesses, no Roman guards writing reports. Every supposed appearance is to people already predisposed to believe, or people within the movement. That's exactly how religious visions work. They are subjective, private, unverifiable. Psychology gives us another explanation. When people are grieving, especially after traumatic loss, visions of the deceased are common. Psychologists call these bereavement hallucinations. Studies show a significant percentage of widows report seeing or hearing their deceased spouse after death. The disciples, devastated by the loss of their teacher, could easily have experienced similar visions. That doesn't make the visions worthless, but it does explain them naturally without invoking the supernatural. Then consider the time gap. Mark, the earliest gospel, was written around 70 CE, almost 40 years after Jesus' death. That's like writing today about events in the 1980s with no written sources to rely on. Over those decades, stories grow, legends expand, memories change. By the time the Gospels were written, the resurrection had become the central myth. And one more striking detail, the original ending of Mark's Gospel, the earliest account, does not include any appearances of Jesus at all. It ends with the women finding the empty tomb and fleeing in fear, saying nothing to anyone. That's it. The resurrection appearances in Mark were added later by scribes who felt the story ended too abruptly. That means the earliest gospel didn't even record Jesus appearing alive again. If the resurrection was the most important event in history, why was it missing from the earliest account? All of this builds a picture. The resurrection wasn't recorded as history. It evolved as a story. It began with visions and faith experiences, grew into empty tomb traditions, and eventually blossomed into detailed but contradictory resurrection narratives. And think about the logic. If an all-powerful God really wanted to prove the resurrection to the world, why rely on such weak evidence? Why not have Jesus appear in the temple courts of Jerusalem before thousands, or present himself to the Roman authorities, or leave behind undeniable evidence? Instead, we're left with decades later writings, filled with contradictions and relying entirely on faith. That doesn't sound like history. That sounds like storytelling. When we step back from the resurrection claim and weigh it as we would any other historical event, it fails every test. History demands contemporary evidence, consistency of sources, and independent corroboration. The resurrection has none of these. Instead, it has late writings, theological agendas, contradictions, silence from outsiders, and natural explanations that make far more sense. And the irony is that many Christians today will say, "You just need faith." But that's exactly the problem. Faith is not evidence. Faith can make you believe anything, from alien abductions to ghost stories to cult leaders promising paradise. Faith is what people use when they don't have facts. If the resurrection were genuinely historical, faith wouldn't be required. We would all know it as undeniable fact, the way we know the Roman Empire existed, or that Julius Caesar was assassinated. Those things are history. The resurrection is not. Let's dig even deeper into how legends are formed, because this helps explain the resurrection story. Whenever a beloved leader dies unexpectedly, especially in a violent or humiliating way, their followers often refuse to accept it. They reinterpret events, create hopeful stories, and sometimes even transform their leader into a godlike figure. We've seen this pattern in countless cultures. After Alexander the Great died, myths quickly sprang up about him being divine. After Julius Caesar's assassination, his supporters claimed to have seen a comet that proved he was taken up among the gods. The same thing happened with Jesus. His humiliating crucifixion was a crushing blow, but his followers refused to accept defeat. They turned tragedy into triumph by declaring he had risen and conquered death. It's a human psychological response, not a historical miracle. And here's the kicker. The resurrection wasn't even universally accepted among early Christians. Some sects in the first century believed in a purely spiritual resurrection, not a bodily one. Others debated what kind of body Jesus supposedly had after death. Paul himself talks about a spiritual body, not a physical corpse walking out of a tomb. That tells us belief in resurrection was never simple or unanimous. It evolved, it divided, it changed. So why does the resurrection story persist today? Because it's powerful. The idea that death is not the end, that suffering can be overturned, that despair can be followed by joy. That's a deeply human hope. Stories of rebirth and renewal resonate because they speak to our fears and our longings. But just because a story is emotionally powerful doesn't make it true. Fairy tales are powerful too. Myths shape cultures, but they don't become history simply because people want them to be. If we apply the same skepticism to Christianity that Christians themselves apply to every other religion, the truth becomes obvious. No Christian believes in the resurrection of Osiris, or the miracles of Krishna, or Muhammad's night journey on a flying horse. They dismiss those stories as myths, but when it comes to their own tradition, they make an exception. That's not honesty, that's bias. The same critical eye we use on other religions must be turned on Christianity itself. And when we do, the resurrection falls apart. Let's not forget the sheer practicality of it all. Dead bodies don't come back. That's not cynicism, that's biology. Once the brain is deprived of oxygen for minutes, it decays irreversibly. Cells break down, organs shut down, decomposition begins. To believe resurrection is to believe a suspension of everything we know about life and death. And yet, there is not a shred of medical, physical, or historical evidence to support such a claim. We know that dead people stay dead, except in ancient religious stories. And here's something even more telling. Despite billions of believers today, no one has ever produced a resurrection in modern times. Not one, despite hospitals, cameras, and constant observation of death. If God could raise Jesus, why not raise anyone else? Why not keep proving it across the centuries? The silence speaks volumes. At the end of the day, the resurrection is not a fact of history. It's a myth told by desperate followers to make sense of their loss, polished by later writers, and carried forward by tradition. It's a story of hope, not a record of reality. And like all myths, it thrives not on evidence but on belief. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can cling to a 2,000-year-old story that doesn't hold up under scrutiny, or we can face reality with courage. We can accept that death is real, that life is fragile, and that meaning comes not from ancient tales but from what we create here and now. And maybe that's the true freedom. Because when we let go of the need for a resurrection, we stop waiting for a savior to fix the world, and we start taking responsibility ourselves. When we see the resurrection for what it is, a story, not history, we can finally build a life grounded in truth, not myth. So the next time someone says Jesus rose from the dead, remember this. Stories can inspire, but evidence is what separates history from legend. And the resurrection? It belongs firmly in the category of legend. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration eye-opening, stay tuned for more deep dives into the myths, the contradictions, and the stories that have shaped belief. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep grounded.